Welcome to European Union Governance and Policy Challenges, an online training from the University of Washington. This training was co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and was produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. Hello everyone, welcome to our update to the Defending Europe section of this lecture series. Obviously, defense and security for the European continent is one of the areas that's changed most since we originally recorded these lectures, and I'm really looking forward to giving you the 2025 update as we talk through and think a little bit about what's changed, how European security and how we and the EU view it is developing, and really kind of dig into some of the longer standing issues and look towards the future for what's going to happen in European security and defense. The biggest thing I think we really want to talk about here in light of developments in Ukraine and sort of an increase in Russian aggression across the continent is the extent to which we're no longer just talking about a pure military defense space. There's plenty of that and plenty to talk about there. But the area in which conflict has expanded and the number of ways that we need to think about defense and security has just expanded massively. Many of these were in place before. It's not that they didn't exist, but they've really come to the forefront as we've seen some gray area warfare take place, pushing in economic domains, use of proxy entities. A great example is the Houthis in the Red Sea as an Iranian proxy. And just the level of complication and the number of areas that need to be covered. So I've listed here just some of the domains. There's the traditional sea, air, land, and increasingly space domain for surveillance satellites and communication and things like that. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is an ongoing area of military and security effort, and it's one of the places where the European Union and NATO have really contributed very aggressively in the current conflict in Ukraine, while not necessarily directly firing upon Russian assets. There has been an incredibly intense intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's often called ISR for short, working hand in hand with the forces of Ukraine to help identify, target, and eventually for the forces of Ukraine to reach out and actually directly attack Russian assets based on that information. Undersea warfare is an ongoing part of this. We've seen this with the Nord Stream gas pipeline being attacked and attacks on undersea cables. That goes hand in hand with infrastructure. Communications infrastructure is vulnerable. Satellites are quite vulnerable if you can reach up to them in space. A wide variety of other pieces of infrastructure can be attacked either directly or through the cyber domain, electronically attacked and either diminished in capacity or disabled. Energy, obviously, is closely linked in with this, energy networks. Shipping and commerce, cyber and network warfare cover just about anything you can imagine, attacking it through the information realm. Mis- and disinformation in media and social network are another gray area of operations where either there's an attempt to confuse, mislead, pull away political support or chip away political support. It's a huge area of effort and one in which Russia in particular has been very successful. Some softer security elements with foreign aid and pulling other countries into your sphere. You could also look at weapons sales as an area that help to realign allies. And this is, in some way, more of a set of Cold War techniques of creating spheres of influence, but it's certainly active now. We're seeing sanctioning countries, which is one of the few things that a country or an alliance can do to push short of actual military action when they wish to punish or reprimand another country. We're seeing contention over access to raw materials We're seeing a huge amount of contention over export controls, what technology and in what form can be exported to who, and how do we keep advanced technologies out of the hands of our allies, and is there even any point to doing that when countries like China are sharing advanced technologies quite rapidly? Very difficult. I already mentioned proxy group warfare. Electronic warfare is increasingly going on. We're seeing attacks on the GPS network that's used for all kinds of location-based things, either denying it or actively spoofing it to make it look like, for example, an aircraft or a ship is in a location that it's not. Financing and use of terror groups, both sort of directly controlled by a host nation like Russia or Iran, or much more loosely affiliated groups that are then working and active, for example, in the European Union. Migration influence, where either a situation is created where water supplies are cut off or famine is created and therefore people in that area have to move, or sometimes literally picking up groups of migrants, putting them on the bus and taking them to the border of the European Union to help put pressure on governments on the other side. This has happened with some regularity, so migration is a huge area. We're seeing a lot more about nuclear and weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, a lot of discussion of this in the Iranian case, and the question of if Iran is working successfully towards a nuclear weapon, are other nations in and around the EU concerned about their nuclear umbrella, also the pullback of the American nuclear umbrella that's been a historic source of tremendous security for the European continent. What does it mean when France is the only European Union nation with nuclear weapons now that the UK has pulled out of the EU while still being part of NATO? These things get very complicated. Closely related to sanctions, we've talked about financial networks, and this is also an area for cyber attacks. What happens when potential adversaries directly invest in or own things like ports? China's been buying up the rights to operate and sometimes the land of a wide variety of ports in the European area. Gray area provocations, where things that are not really quite military operations, but very aggressive operation of Coast Guard vessels or maritime militia or physical militia groups on the ground, as we saw with the downing of an aircraft by supposedly militia troops over Ukraine in 2018. There's these things. There's a lot of area. Who's really doing it? Can you create a question about who's taking these actions? There have also been cases where troops on one side of the border, in this case Russian troops, were physically picking up the barbed wire fence that represented the border and moving it forward 50 meters overnight just to see if it would create a response. What happens when you literally push the border fence out by a short margin every night? Is that the same as militarily taking domain, or is it a provocation? There's a lot of questions here. Also, increasingly, we're seeing humanitarian crises as part of security. This is linked to the migration issue. And climate change and changes in extreme weather are creating real pressures on security and defense elements. How are they going to operate in a universe of more extreme weather? And again, amplifying many of these other domains that we've already talked about. These changes are a huge part of the conversation about long-term security and what it looks like in 20, 30, or 40 years, both directly on the military side and in particular in this kind of multi-domain security environment that we're trying to talk our way through. So here we're going to go back deep into a much more traditional security conversation. This is a map of NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War era, and we see a couple of things. The blue countries are obviously NATO countries. Red is Warsaw Pact, two alliances, Western aligned and Soviet aligned. that really defined what security in Europe meant through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. A couple other things really stand out here. We have the gray countries, which were the neutrals or the non aligned countries: Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, Yugoslavia, Sweden, and Finland, all not directly aligned and not part of either the NATO or the Warsaw Pact alliance. And they'll become a big part of our story as we talk forward and really look at what followed. But much as some of our earlier discussions, you kind of have to start with maps of Rome to understand the evolution of Europe into what it is today. Essentially, all maps starting with European security and defense topics have to start with this NATO and Warsaw Pact owning opposite sides of the map. It's also worth noting, if you want to look at the Soviet view, that with Norway reaching around the top and Turkey and Greece down at the bottom, the Soviet Union has historically really felt that NATO was kind of wrapping around them and trying to contain them and maybe pincer in on them a little bit. It's up to us in the discussion to find out whether that feeling was in fact justified, but that's definitely been a large part of their discussion. And as we talk about Ukraine and developments there, this feeling that NATO is pushing forward and closing in is really a huge part of what's going on the Soviet and later Russian side. So let's just take a quick moment and talk about NATO. You've already seen quite a bit about the European, and we'll talk about the European Union and its defense aspects shortly. But just to bring you up to speed on NATO, today 32 NATO member states. 2 of those are in North America, the US and Canada. The rest are obviously in Europe. 3 NATO states are nuclear powers, and those same 3, the US, France, and the United Kingdom, are UN Security Council permanent members. 10 NATO members are former Warsaw Pact states. I'll pull up that map in a few minutes for you to have a look at. 4 are former Yugoslav republics. North Macedonia is the most recent of those to join NATO in March 2020. It's just worth noting that for most of NATO's history, France has been a special case. They've been politically part of NATO, but were not part of NATO's integrated military planning through most of the Cold War era. And so while we'll talk about NATO as a bloc, and particularly historically, and France is now fully integrated into NATO's military component as well, it's just worth noting that they've had a special status through most of NATO's history. You're probably familiar with the name, at least, for NATO's Article 5. It's famously the article that provides for common defense, saying an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members and will be responded to collectively. This has only been invoked once, when the US was attacked on 9/11 of 2001. And so it's an interesting oddity that the only time that NATO has in fact been called to common defense was in defense of the United States. NATO is arguably the most successful defensive alliance in history. It, throughout the Cold War, never ended up firing a shot in anger. It was an important part, obviously a critical linchpin of providing security for the European continent and the west side of the European continent in particular. But they never shot a single shot in anger, dropped a bomb, anything against the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, or any of their successor states. In fact, NATO didn't fire its first shot until intervention in Bosnia in 1994, and later in 1989 in the remaining sort of rump Yugoslavia. NATO also got involved in intervention in Afghanistan in 2003 and stayed there through 2014. It's done a lot of work in anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden, intervention in Libya in 2011. And NATO's kind of in a really interesting place today where they've been heavily involved. You would argue, I think, effectively full wartime status on the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance side in Ukraine while not actually firing any shots directly. So there's an interesting disconnect between the pieces of NATO that are fully stood up, fully engaged, and very active now, versus the parts that are a little bit more on the sidelines in the Ukrainian conflict. This GIF shows the evolution of NATO, and there's a couple things that really stand out. NATO's established in 1949 with a core of Western members. Turkey and Greece join in 1952, forming a solid southern flank. And it's worth noting that those two are somewhat special cases on their own, having been in a continuous state of sort of low grade to medium grade tension, occasionally flaring into considerably more than medium grade tension. But from a NATO perspective, they have really been tremendously solid members and a critical part of the larger scale question of European defense. The other piece I'd like to really pull to your attention is the eastward expansion of NATO, with former East Germany joining as part of a reunified Germany in 1990. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, a considerable eastward push, taking in not just former Warsaw Pact states, but countries, particularly in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who had in fact been directly and fully part of the Soviet Union itself. We then see expansion into the Balkan states as former Yugoslavian states become part of NATO, in many cases first, and then start to join the European Union. And then, if you want to talk about, from a NATO side, impacts of the conflict in Ukraine, having both Finland and more recently Sweden, historically neutrals, in Sweden's case with over 200 years of European neutrality as part of a core part of their history, having those countries decide that the threat from Russia is simply too great to continue to be independent, moving them into NATO is one of the biggest impacts of Putin's policies of aggressions, and arguably has done more to move NATO closer to Russia than anything that's happened before. And that's not going to be a core part of our story today, but I think it's an important part of the evolution to talk through. Now let's take a few minutes to talk about the European Union in this same context. One of the challenges for the EU in the defense space is that with NATO, and particularly with an American-led NATO, at the core of defending Europe for the last 70 years since the end of the Second World War, what's the EU's role in this? Are they doing the same thing as NATO? There's a lot of overlap between members, but they're not precisely the same. This map calls out the new candidate states, with Ukraine, Moldova, and off the edge of the map, Georgia, as EU candidates. We've got a European continent that is largely united under the European Union, but not fully. Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and much more recently the UK as major European countries that are not just outside the EU, but not looking to be members, and in the UK's case, one who's actively left the European Union. What does it mean when you have NATO countries that aren't part of the EU and EU countries that aren't part of NATO? How does that interact in the defense space? And this is something that's maybe not been very completely addressed. I'd also like to call your attention in the Baltic area to the relatively exposed position of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They spend a lot of time very, very concerned about security and defense as countries that formerly were part of the Soviet Union, are geographically somewhat isolated out on the edge of the EU and NATO, and obviously sharing a substantial border with Russia and Belarus, which can only be viewed at this point, I think, as a heavily engaged client state of Russia from a security and defense perspective. So the question of NATO and NATO's dynamic, I think, is really addressed by NATO's first Secretary General, General Hastings Ismay, who said, in so many words, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, things have evolved tremendously since then, but the first two, I think, are still very relevant conversations. If we change Soviet Union to Russia, how do we keep Russia out of Europe from a defense and security standpoint? And how do we keep the Americans fully engaged and focused on being part of European defense? Remain critical questions, and particularly in 2025, where questions of American engagement in European security remain open and dynamic. How is Europe going to step up, take a bigger role, take a more leading role, and respond to a security environment with very, very visible threats from Russia, and also real questions about long-term American engagement and how much and how quickly and how fully the U.S. might respond, and a strong push from the American side for the Europeans to really sort of pick up the ball and run a little more with driving their own defense, while still the U.S. really also pushing to maintain tremendous influence. And I think there's kind of a dual message there from the U.S. side, really wanting the Europeans to do more, to pay more, to be more engaged, while the U.S. still retains policy primacy. We maybe haven't quite worked out the balance there in the long run. It's critical to note how much NATO is a U.S.-driven entity. U.S. defense spending represents about 70% of NATO's total spending, but that amount is obviously not focused on Europe. That represents U.S. global investment. The money is a huge part, but when you then talk about actual deployable assets and combat power, something like 70% of NATO's direct combat power is U.S. owned and driven, but that underrepresents the roles of the U.S. in the complex combat chains, what they call kill chains, where targets are identified, targeted, and then attacked in sort of Western-style network-centric warfare. And so while the U.S. is a huge part of spending, I think, in fact, U.S. capacity and influence driving what NATO can do, both directly defensively and then particularly when we're talking about deploying outside NATO's physical footprint, those are areas where the U.S. is particularly overwhelming in their presence. It's worth noting that in the history of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the military head of NATO's forces, 100% of the holders of that position have been American, 20 of 20. And the deputy for that position, 24 of the 32 of them have been British and the remainder German. And I think that kind of represents the history of this alliance, which is American-driven, in close cooperation with the British and some help from the Germans, is how the Americans have always thought about NATO, that this was really, really an American defense entity, that the Europeans participated in also. But here in this modern era, that really becomes a problem. If NATO is an American-led entity and the Americans are pulling back from it, where does that leave Europe in terms of its own defense? And the European Union obviously becomes a huge part of this conversation as increasingly the absolutely dominant political entity in the European continent, made up of its member states and representing not just an economic union, but a political union and increasingly one with a military side. Just take a moment here to note the expansion of the EU in terms of its candidate members. There's the 27 countries in dark blue that are current members of the European Union, and then a whole raft of candidate countries. We have almost the entire former Yugoslav state as, or successor states, as either current European Union members, candidate members, including Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and Northern Macedonia. Only Kosovo remains outstanding as a potential candidate. And then recently added in the candidate space are Ukraine and Moldova. Georgia will presumably follow, but they're right now, along with Kosovo, just a potential candidate. And Turkey has been a candidate for many, many years, but their candidacy has been frozen over concerns for their adherence to the rule of law and humanitarian and human rights potential violations. So it'll be very interesting to see if some of the other candidate members end up getting sort of pushed ahead of Turkey. And while the EU and NATO are obviously different organizations with different memberships, the question of how to keep Turkey close on the security side, which has historically been a NATO thing, while they're being sanctioned and not allowed to move forward in their candidacy for the EU in what was considered traditionally more the economic side. But as we see the EU beginning to pick up more defense elements, does that change this conversation vis-a-vis Turkey? We'll kind of have to see how that develops. We don't really need to get deeply into this chart, but this is an expression of the conversation I was having on the last slide, in which the history of the EU and how people really thought of it was primarily as an economic and political alliance. If you look down to the bottom of this chart, you'll see Western European Union, which was officially the defense side of the European Community process. And if you go and you look up their Wikipedia article, you'll see Western European Union, and then in parentheses, largely defunct through the 70s and the 80s. And so the WEU, and then the later development of the Common Foreign and Security Policy as part of the Maastricht process in the 90s, acknowledging that the EU, or the entity that would later become the EU, had a strong interest in foreign and security policy and defense policy. But it's not really until 2009, with the advent of the Lisbon Treaty and the full integration of the EU as a single entity, that the security and defense elements really become European Union problems fully, directly, and completely, as we see the integrated blue bloc of the EU on the right-hand side. And so these two things, the separate entity of NATO really taking over European defense, and then the EU's consolidation of a wide variety of themes and areas that only really fully acknowledged defense and security as a core area for the EU itself relatively recently, less than 20 years ago, really lead us to help to understand this challenge for the modern EU. Is it a defense entity? Well, the European treaties contain a mutual defense clause, but that's never been a main focus of the EU. It's not really a defense alliance directly. That's NATO. But what about EU members that aren't NATO? What about a NATO that's American driven and potentially pulling back? Can you run NATO without full American participation? Certainly not as it's currently constituted. And where does this leave the EU in an attempt to step forward, pick up, and increase its presence as a European defense identity separate from NATO? I'll just take a quick moment to show this map of NATO and its various forms of partnerships. We don't need to dig deeply into this, but dark blue are NATO members. Countries with a membership action plan and enhanced opportunity partners are in sort of a mid and lighter blue. Got some countries with individual partnership action plans. The Partnership for Peace, which was a large-scale opportunity for countries to begin to work and cooperate with NATO, but was not promised as a direct pathway to NATO alliance. In fact, even Russia is technically a member of Partnership for Peace. There's a separate NATO-Mediterranean dialogue. There's a separate Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and this relatively new category of NATO global partners. Japan and Australia are heavily integrated into the Western Defense Alliance, particularly through the US and the UK, and the Five Eyes intelligence process, if you're familiar with that, but stand separate from NATO because NATO is first and foremost the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and you can only be a member if you're a North Atlantic country, right? So while NATO is as a specific entity, just this North Atlantic thing, it's important to note that NATO as a defense alliance has global implications. It's also worth noting that the Global South is obviously very, very clearly not represented in NATO's military alliance domain. It's an obvious gap in this map and the larger question of global security. Taking a look back at this overlap question that I've mentioned a couple times, we have 4 countries that are EU members that are not NATO members. Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus are not NATO members. We have NATO members that are not EU members, including Iceland, UK, Norway, Montenegro, Albania, Turkey, and then obviously the US and Canada. And this overlap or lack of overlap question really starts to become a huge thing as it develops. It's worth noting that Sweden had not yet joined when this map was made, so they're still coded blue, but they are obviously now a full NATO member. I'm not going to talk a ton about the Yugoslav wars, other than that it's a real turning point for European defense. This is a huge conflict with humanitarian aspects, direct military combat, substantial refugee issues, right on what was at the time the EU's doorstep. And what had been a sort of Cold War view of security and defense really needed some updating. You know, the Yugoslav wars were really terrible, with war crimes and a large war crimes tribunal, and vast numbers of deaths, refugee movements, internally displaced persons. And the US, and as a NATO member, sort of started off with the point of view that this was a European problem and not really one appropriate for NATO and not one for US intervention, and kind of left it to Europe to figure out what they were doing. And this is a place where this gap I've been talking about between a European defense identity and NATO's defense identity really became a problem. Eventually, the US and NATO got much more involved, leading to the wrap up of this conflict with the Washington Agreement and Dayton Accords, and I4, and later in Kosovo, KFOR, as peacekeeping and, in some cases, peacemaking entities that really militarily enforced a peace on Serbia and other pieces of the conflict. We're not going to talk a ton about Kosovo today, but Kosovo is really a European supported Kosovar state separate from Serbia, that simultaneously has been recognized as a potential candidate for EU membership while not being recognized as a country by 5 EU states, Spain, Greece, Cyprus, Slovakia, and Romania, because of their concerns about recognition for breakaway states. All 5 of those countries have at least potential breakaway regions, and they're tremendously concerned about breakaway regions potentially being recognized as viable states and given EU membership. So, again, that's not one of our main themes today, but it's just a really interesting question in space for the whole defense and security conversation, and the sort of echoes of the Yugoslav wars in European defense and security policy continue to be loudly heard and will be for many years to come. So, this question of European defense identity has been ongoing for decades. And what does this mean? A U.S. policy success, this comes from Madeleine Albright in 1998, are the 3Ds. And this is a U.S. proposed concept that somehow very quickly just kind of became an understanding and even a mantra in European defense, that whatever Europe did on its own needed to follow the 3Ds. No duplication, not doing the same thing as NATO is already doing. No decoupling, setting up a separate parallel system from the US and NATO. And then no discrimination against non-EU members of NATO. And what's interesting is that this kind of freezes the European defense identity conversation. It brings it to a crashing halt, because for Europe to set up a separate system that wasn't completely NATO linked, there would have to be duplication, right? There's no way to go forward without duplicating some of those functions and capabilities. And at least some things that looked like decoupling would almost certainly be part of that as well. If you're running separate exercises with NATO countries involved that aren't part of NATO, then that looks a lot like decoupling automatically. And so from a US perspective and from a US NATO perspective, the adoption of the 3Ds as a well understood agreement, even if not sort of formally part of a treaty, was a tremendous policy success, and still part of kind of what's freezing or holding up this conversation today in 2025 are these ideas. At the same time, it's very clear to Europe that there is some need to step up and start developing internal defense capacity and experience. And so in 1992, the Petersburg tasks are identified, and these come from negotiations at the Petersburg Hotel outside Bonn in Germany. Although the name sounds perhaps more Russian oriented, it's really just where the talks took place. And what was identified was the 3.5 concepts here. Humanitarian and rescue tasks were an appropriate area for European defense action in a standalone way. Peacekeeping tasks were identified as an appropriate area for European effort. Crisis management, which is a very vague term, was identified as an appropriate task. And then kind of quietly at the end, they note, including peacemaking tasks. For those of you who aren't familiar, the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking is one of permissiveness and consent by the parties involved. Peacekeeping generally involves a force coming in and standing between two or more other warring or conflict parties with their agreement to help reduce incidents along the line and provide sort of a buffer between them to help keep conflicts from reigniting. Peacemaking task is obviously non-consensual, where a peacemaking force will come in and directly intervene and remove the capacity quite directly for the warring parties to fight. And sometimes that works, and other times it just ends up being a three-way conflict where, in fact, the two warring parties start working, if not directly cooperatively, towards similar ends to fighting the peacemaking group. So that's a much dicier situation than peacekeeping, which is relatively uncontroversial. But even these are relatively low-key and would often qualify as military operations other than war. It's not really a true, full and complete European defense identity parallel to or separate from NATO, right? Where this is nowhere near that. On that chart that I showed a few slides ago showing the increasing level of European integration into the eventual much broader European Union that essentially owns economics, politics, security, and defense all together, we start to see some clarity developing. What was known as ESDP, European Security and Defense Policy, evolves into CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy, and CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy. And so those are the areas in the EU, their formal domains as they're known today. And they're a very serious part of EU policy and one that's looking to be developed much more fully as time evolves. Officially, CFSP is the domain of the European Council, but on a day-to-day basis, it's overseen by the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The title includes and Vice President of the European Union, so it's those go together, they're not separate. Right now that position is held by Kaja Kallas, who's the former PM of Estonia. She's been in that job less than a year today, since December 2024. And that's becoming, in the post-Ukraine invasion era, a really critical corner of EU policymaking and an incredibly influential position. Since that position was created as part of the Lisbon protocols, it's been important, but now the extent to which awareness and concern about security and defense policies are really at the forefront for the EU more than they ever have been. It's now a truly linchpin strategic position. I'll just note that the European External Action Service, which is the diplomatic service of the EU as its own entity, separate from the diplomatic services of its member countries, also falls under CFSP as the foreign policy portion of that conversation. So I noted that with the advent of the Petersburg tasks, the EU is beginning to sort of get its feet under it in the early 90s in terms of foreign intervention. And historically, the EU really prefers soft power initiatives, things like going out and training prosecutors and working on rule of law and working with police forces. This is much more Europe's preference in terms of outreach and building alliances is on the soft power side. But with the Petersburg tasks established, there's an increasing capacity for the European Union to do more direct intervention. There's a couple items here I'll just note that still exist and are you'll hear as you hear this discussion. And one is an agreement that NATO has the right of first refusal on missions. That if there are Petersburg task style missions out there, that NATO is really the primary organization, and only in a case where NATO has considered it and declined to follow up will the EU look at directly taking on a task. It's also worth noting that the Berlin Plus agreements of 2003 allows the EU to access NATO facilities, tools, and forces from national forces that had been assigned to NATO. And so this is really kind of a foundation for some interoperability between the EU as a defense entity and NATO. You'll hear PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, increasingly as an EU mechanism for groups smaller than the full 27 membership to take on initiatives in smaller groups to help move one portion or another of the defense question together with EU blessing and engagement, but not necessarily as a formal operation of the EU itself. And one of my biggest surprises in quite some time was how rapidly and effectively the EU, not just its members, but the EU as its own entity and on its own hook, came together to support Ukraine, not just with money and not just with national support, but with direct funding from the EU itself that was allowed to be used for purchasing weapons and lethal aid. The EU's tendency towards soft power measures and not becoming quite so directly engaged in a military sense had led many observers, including myself, to believe that the EU would probably respond to Ukraine with a somewhat more supportive and engaged, but not really buying lethal weapons directly with EU money way. But that's not how it came about at all. In fact, the EU turned around very quickly and made a very, very powerful show of support for Ukraine post invasion. And that's in sort of direct contravention to quite tepid support for Ukraine as the process of taking over Crimea and the Donbass regions after 2014 took place. So while Europe and NATO get tremendous credit for their response after the direct invasion of Ukraine in 2021, the lack of response through the first phase of that conflict also has to be called out as probably a significant long-term failure. So it's worth noting that the EU right now today is carrying on significant military operations more or less globally. And you'll see a variety of labels. You'll see the U4, the European Force, and UNAV4, European Naval Force labels. EU's run about 30 overseas operations since about 2002, mixed civilian and military. The military ones include U4 in Macedonia in 2003, in Bosnia since 2004, Democratic Republic of the Congo since 2006 or in 2006, and Chad and the Central African Republic since 2007. UNAV4, naval forces, we've seen Operation Atalanta doing anti-piracy around Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Operation Irini works on maintaining weapons embargoes and to a lesser extent migrant flows from Libya in the Mediterranean. And just in the last couple of years, Operation Aspides in the Red Sea has been working on protecting merchant ships from Houthi attacks. And that's been quite a major deployment with substantial contributions from a wide variety of EU naval forces. So we'll just talk briefly about Ukraine. I think most watchers of this will know the background, but it's hard to overstate how much the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really changed facts on the ground and Europeans' response, both in a humanitarian sense and in a military sense. It's helped to revitalize NATO. It's helped to revitalize a conversation about defense purchasing and where budgets are going to be spent and allocated for more direct traditional spending on defense, such as fighter aircraft, tanks, radar airplanes, and really full traditional peer conflict oriented measures for the EU. So most of the history of this, this began with the 2014 Russian takeover of the Crimea and Donbass regions. By 2022, there are nearly 8 million refugees from Ukraine in Europe, according to the UNHCR. That number is down to a little closer to 5 million currently, although there's quite a bit of change in that number as things progress in Ukraine. As combat gets worse, people move out of Ukraine and into the EU looking for safe havens. And when things stabilize, more people will move back towards Ukraine. But obviously they're just making personal and individual decisions about what seems safe and functional. It's worth noting there's about 3.7 million internally displaced persons inside Ukraine, well over 10 million stranded in dangerous areas that can't effectively leave. We don't have good numbers on the military and civilians killed on both sides of the conflict, but it's substantial. The European Peace Facility was created in March 2021 for EU common security and defense policy missions, partner peace support operations, and strengthening third state capacities. That very quickly became a Ukraine-focused facility. And so we've seen, 5 billion euros originally from that, and then that's been refreshed with another 5 billion euros to buy lethal and non-lethal military equipment, medical supplies, and a wide variety of other things. It's worth noting, we'll talk about this more in the lecture about migration, that the EU has been incredibly willing to accept and give support and work rights and other things to refugees from Ukraine under their temporary protection scheme. That was supposed to end in early 2026. That's been extended now for another year into 2027. And so historically, one of the criticisms of Europe and the EU was that they sort of stood a little bit back from some of these conflicts and were hesitant to accept refugees. But in the case of Ukraine, I don't think there's any way to describe what the EU has done but stepping up very, very quickly and very, very aggressively to sort of make this work and to create safe havens for Ukrainian refugees and to create a regime in which they can access housing and medical care and have the right to work while hopefully leading towards their eventual return to Ukraine when an eventual state of peace is created. So there's a lot going on here. Obviously Russia and the potential for Russian aggression is kind of at the top of the list. But as we move towards looking forward and long-term issues, even if Ukraine is resolved, there's a wide variety of other areas with substantial potential for Russian intervention, including Moldova, Georgia, where there's been Russian aggression in the past, the recent past. The Baltic states we talked about. We didn't really discuss the Kaliningrad enclave on the Baltic, which is Russian territory, kind of tucked in between the Baltic states and Poland, but it's a presumed hotspot for if Russia becomes interested in pushing for territorial ambitions towards the EU. The issue of sort of Russia in European security and defense is nowhere near solved, and presumably even if the Ukraine war were somehow wrapped up in a solid long-term agreement, that doesn't end the discussion of Russia in Europe from a security perspective at all. There's also a tremendous number of global questions and short, mid, and long-term threats. China remains a powerful economic contender, challenging the post-Cold War order aggressively. They offer military and security threats across that entire space of domains that we looked at in that slide up front, and also a competitor for connections, resources, and allies throughout the developing world. A lot of security and defense concerns for Europe originate in the larger neighborhood across the Mediterranean with the Middle East and North Africa. There's issues from migration to autocratic threats to populations, weapons proliferation, food and water security, piracy, terrorism, migration influence. These are all huge, huge areas extending through defense, security, migration policy, humanitarian policy. It's and this is right in Europe's sort of front porch. It simply can't be ignored. The Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict has quieted down for the moment, but retains capacity to flare back up. Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey are in an ongoing state of tension, with northern Cyprus still claimed and occupied by Turkey. That was supposed to be resolved as part of Cyprus' accession to the EU, but wasn't. So we're now in an odd position where Turkey, as an EU candidate country, is physically occupying territory of an existing EU member state, Cyprus, and Cyprus and Greece are closely aligned politically and sort of with each other and against Turkey in particular. And so that's very much an issue closer than on Europe's front doorstep. That's really almost an internal issue in terms of European security now. And let's not forget the entire rest of the world, including EU members' territories abroad, former colonial interests. This is a huge space, and one just fraught with challenges and difficulties and opportunities. And while a lot of that kind of gets hidden behind the current conflict in Ukraine and issues with US and European and NATO security, we have to remember all of it exists in a really large context of everything going on in the world. And as the EU becomes a more full spectrum entity that's not just worried about politics and not just worried about economics, but also really taking on security and defense as one of their core roles, um, all of these global questions really end up on the EU's doorstep as well. So thanks for taking the time to listen through this. There's a lot going on here. It's rapidly evolving, and I look forward to having the chance to discuss with some of you questions and themes that may come up going forward. Thanks so much. Thank you for joining us for this European Union Governance and Policy Challenges lecture, co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.